On Christmas night, I sat at my family's long dining table under the glittering chandelier when my dad suddenly turned to me and said I was street garbage, that I should sit in the kitchen and shut my mouth. My sister Jessica laughed out loud and called me an idiot, and the rest of the family carried on as if nothing had happened, as if humiliating me was part of the celebration. In that moment, I felt the sting of every year I had been silenced, every insult I had swallowed, and every time I was treated like I did not belong. But instead of arguing back, I stood up quietly, walked out into the cold night, and made one phone call I had been holding inside me for years. 1 week later, an envelope arrived at my family's perfect table, and when my dad tore it open, the truth spilled out in a way that none of them could laugh off. What was inside shattered the lies they had lived by, and it was only the beginning of everything that followed. The Christmas lights were strung along the porch of my parents' house, glowing against the cold December night. But all I felt as I stepped inside was a knot in my stomach. The warmth of the dining room should have been comforting. Instead, every chair at that long, polished oak table felt like a reminder that I was the outsider in my own family. My dad's voice filled the room as he spoke to the guests. His words always grand, his laughter booming, as though the entire evening existed to showcase him. My mom flitted back and forth, checking on dishes, making sure everyone else was happy, her eyes barely glancing at me when I came in. My sister Jessica sat at his right side, smiling like she belonged on the cover of a magazine, her hair styled to perfection, her voice dripping with confidence. She had always known how to charm them. I lowered my coat onto the chair at the far end of the table and tried to steady myself. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon rolls should have reminded me of childhood holidays, but instead it felt heavy, almost suffocating. I wanted so badly to just get through the meal without a scene, to survive another Christmas without being pulled into the cycle of humiliation that had defined so many others. For a few minutes it seemed possible. Plates were passed around, wine glasses clinked together. Laughter rippled down the table. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a piece of turkey, nodding politely if anyone looked my way, but it never lasted long. My dad always had to remind me of my place. He set down his fork with a sharp clink against the china and turned his gaze on me, and the room went quiet. "You are street garbage. Sit in the kitchen and shut your mouth." His words cut sharper than the knife I held. They rang out across the table, and I swear I could feel the weight of every pair of eyes turned toward me. For a second, no one breathed. Then Jessica let out a laugh that sliced the silence like broken glass. "We can't eat with an idiot," she said, her tone playful, yet cruel, her eyes sparkling with the thrill of being in on the joke. My face burned hot, but I kept my hands steady. I wanted to scream, to throw the glass of wine in her face, to remind them all that I was their daughter and sister, not some stray animal they had pulled in from the street. But I swallowed it. I pressed my lips together until they hurt. My dad picked his fork back up. Conversation resumed as though nothing had been said, and I was left to sit there with my humiliation laid bare like a stain on the white tablecloth. I pushed my chair back quietly. The sound of the legs scraping against the wood floor was drowned out by their laughter, by Jessica's stories of her latest promotion, by the clinking of glasses. I carried my plate into the kitchen, though no one had asked me to, and sat down alone at the small table by the window. The glass fogged slightly from the warmth of the house against the freezing night air outside. I stared at the lights strung across the backyard fence, blinking red and green, and I felt the tears sting behind my eyes. A piece of cornbread sat untouched on my plate. I picked it up, chewed slowly, but every bite tasted like ashes. From the dining room came the sound of Jessica laughing again, her voice carrying clear as if she wanted me to hear it. I closed my eyes, and for a moment I was 10 years old again, sitting in this same kitchen while my dad scolded me for spilling juice on the carpet, while Jessica got praised for showing him her report card. That same ache of not being enough sat heavy in my chest. But this time, something else flickered underneath. Not just hurt, not just shame. A calm certainty began to form, as though a door had finally opened. Fine. If I was garbage in their eyes, then I would let the trash take itself out. I stood my chair, scraping back louder than I intended. No one looked up from the dining room. They were too caught up in their own celebration. I slipped my coat back on, pulled my scarf tighter, and walked toward the front door. The night air slapped cold against my cheeks the moment I stepped outside. For a few seconds I just stood there, watching the frost of my own breath rise in the porch light. Then I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolled to a familiar number, and pressed call. The line clicked once, twice, then connected. I didn't need to explain. I only said the words I had been holding inside for far too long. "It's time. Send it." The call ended, and I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the realization of what I had just set in motion. Behind me, the house glowed warm laughter spilling faintly into the night air. But I was already walking down the driveway, each step steady, each breath deeper than the last, as if for the first time in years I was finally standing tall. The next morning, I woke with the sour taste of last night still thick in my mouth. My tiny apartment felt colder than usual, as if the humiliation had followed me through the walls and settled into the air itself. The hum of the radiator was faint and unreliable. I pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the ceiling, letting the events of Christmas Eve replay in my mind. My dad's voice calling me street garbage, my sister's laugh slicing through the silence, the way my mom never once looked in my direction. Every detail clung to me. I dragged myself out of bed, made a pot of coffee, and stood by the window with my mug. Outside, the Chicago streets were blanketed with snow, muffling the usual Saturday noise. I thought of all the families gathered happily that morning. Children tearing through presents, parents smiling, neighbors greeting each other with holiday cheer. My family's house was probably still buzzing with conversation and laughter, the memory of what had happened to me already dismissed, like I had never been there at all. I told myself to push the thoughts aside, but they were relentless. Each memory tied itself to an older one, pulling me deeper into a past I had tried for years to forget. I was 10 years old again, standing in the living room with sticky hands from a popsicle, listening to my dad berate me for dripping juice onto his expensive rug. He called me careless and said I would never amount to anything. Jessica stood nearby, her hair tied neatly in a bow, holding her report card with straight A's. He lifted her into the air and twirled her around while I stared at the stain. On the rug, tears stinging my eyes. That pattern never changed. Every success she had was celebrated like a family triumph. Every mistake I made, no matter how small, was an embarrassment he never let me live down. My mom would whisper later that I should not take it personally, that my dad only wanted the best for me. But her words felt hollow. She never stepped between us. She never raised her voice in my defense. Her loyalty was always to him. I leaned against the counter, the coffee warming my hands but doing nothing to steady the ache in my chest. The memories kept coming. In high school, when I won a small writing contest, the first thing my dad said was not congratulations, but that writing was a hobby, not a career. He told me to focus on real work, something that could pay the bills. Jessica was praised for her charm and ambition. Daniel was quietly pushed toward technology. But for me, there was only the constant reminder that I was less. Even as an adult, the pattern held. When I became a teacher, I thought at least I had chosen a profession with meaning. But at every family dinner, my dad would ask when I planned to move on to something better, something worthy of the Carter name. My mom would sigh and say maybe one day I would figure it out. Jessica would smirk and tell me she could introduce me to someone in her company if I wanted to try for a job above my pay grade. It had been years of swallowing their insults, years of telling myself it was not worth the fight. Last night was different, though. There had been something final in the way he said those words, something that tore through the last thread of patience I had left. I pulled my phone closer and scrolled through old photos. There was one of me and Daniel at the lake when we were children. We were splashing water at each other, laughing in the sun. For a moment, I remembered that bond, the silent understanding between us. He was younger, quieter, often overlooked. He never defended me openly, but I always caught him watching, always saw the guilt in his eyes when I was scolded. That photo reminded me he had been there through it all, even if he had not spoken up. The sound of the radiator clanking pulled me back to the present. I rinsed my mug and sat at the small table by the window. I knew I could not just move past what had happened. It was not only about me anymore. It was about the years of being dismissed, about the way my family had turned cruelty into tradition. I decided to take a walk. The streets were quiet, the snow crunching under my boots. I pulled my scarf tighter and let the cold sting my face, hoping it would clear the fog in my mind. At the corner store, families were buying groceries, children tugging on their moms' coats. I felt invisible among them, carrying my own weight of secrets and shame. By the time I returned home, the daylight was fading. I sat at my desk and opened a journal I had abandoned months earlier. The blank page stared back at me, and for the first time in years I felt the urge to write. My pen moved slowly at first, then faster, pouring out everything I had held inside. I wrote about the way my dad's voice echoed in my head, about Jessica's laugh, about my mom's silence. I wrote about how those moments stretched back into my childhood, shaping every part of me. The words tumbled onto the page until my hand cramped. When I stopped, I realized hours had passed. My apartment was dark, the only light the small lamp on my desk. I closed the journal and pressed my hand to the cover, feeling the faint vibration of my own heartbeat beneath it. Writing did not fix anything, but it steadied me. It reminded me that I still had a voice even if my family refused to hear it. I thought again of Daniel. I could picture his expression at the table last night, the way his eyes flicked toward me and then away. There had been something different there. Not just guilt, but hesitation, as if he wanted to say something but could not. That memory lingered as I turned off the lamp and climbed into bed. I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of traffic, my thoughts circling. I knew I could not let last night be just another story in a lifetime of stories where I was silenced. Something had shifted. I had made a call. The wheels were already in motion, but part of me wondered if Daniel might play a role in what was coming. The snow outside continued to fall, covering the city in silence. I closed my eyes and let that silence wrap around me, not as emptiness, but as a pause, a waiting space. For the first time, I was not drowning in humiliation. I was gathering myself. I sat in my car outside the small cafe on Clark Street, watching the steam rise from the cup in my hands. My fingers were cold even through my gloves, but I needed the warmth of the coffee before I walked in. Robert had agreed to meet me there. It had been years since we last spoke face-to-face, but when I called, his voice carried the same calm steadiness I remembered from high school. He said he could spare the afternoon. I had no idea how to start, only that I needed someone who would not laugh, someone who would not dismiss me the way my family always did. When I pushed the glass door open, the bell above it jingled. The smell of roasted beans wrapped around me. Robert was already sitting at a corner table, suit jacket folded neatly over the chair, a legal pad open in front of him. He looked up, smiled, and for a moment I felt like a different version of myself, one who had not just been humiliated in her parents' dining room. Madison Carter. His voice carried both warmth and surprise. He stood to hug me, the gesture formal yet genuine. "You look like the city has been keeping you busy." I sat across from him, setting my cup down. Busy is one word for it. Broken is another. His eyes narrowed, the lawyer in him noticing more than I wanted him to. What happened? I hesitated. Then it all came out. I told him about the Christmas dinner, about my dad's words, about Jessica's laugh. I described the way my mom avoided my eyes and how I carried my plate into the kitchen like a child sent to the corner. My voice cracked more than once, but I forced myself to keep going. Robert listened without interrupting, his pen idle on the pad. He leaned forward as if every detail mattered. When I finally stopped, my hands shaking, he let out a long breath. "That is cruel. He should not have spoken to you like that. He always has. It was just worse this time." Robert tapped the pad gently. "Do you want him to stop, or do you want him to pay?" The question sat between us. I sipped my coffee, though my throat was dry. I do not want another lecture about walking away. I want it to end. I want them to know what it feels like to be silenced. Robert's eyes held mine. "Then you need proof. Words will not change a man like him, but evidence that will." His certainty sent a current through me. For so long I had believed I had no power. Maybe I did not need their approval. Maybe I only needed the truth. We spent an hour sketching out possibilities. He asked about the family business, about Carter Realty, about anything I might have overheard. I told him what I knew, which was not much, but I mentioned Daniel. My younger brother had always been around the edges of things, quieter than Jessica, more observant than he let on. Robert's eyes lit up. "Keep him in mind. People like that see more than anyone realizes." When we finally stood to leave, Robert placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "You are not garbage, Madison. Do not let his words take root. Sometimes the best revenge is giving people a mirror they cannot avoid." I carried his words with me as I walked back into the cold. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes thick against my coat. I drove home slowly, headlights cutting through the gray. By the time I reached my apartment, the city lights blurred through the storm, and I felt the faintest sense of direction. That evening, I knocked on Margaret Lewis's door. She was my neighbor across the hall, a woman in her 70s who always wore soft sweaters and smelled faintly of lavender. She opened the door with a smile, ushering me inside as if she had been expecting me. The warmth of her living room was immediate, filled with the scent of tea and the ticking of an old grandfather clock. "You look tired," she said, pouring me a cup without asking. I told her about the dinner. I did not mean to, but the words spilled out just as they had with Robert. She sat quietly in her armchair, nodding slowly, her hands folded in her lap. When I finished, she looked at me with eyes that had seen decades more than mine. "Families can wound deeper than anyone else," she said. "But you are not powerless. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the strongest thing you can hold." Her words sank into me like a balm. She did not tell me to forgive or forget. She did not excuse their cruelty. She reminded me that choosing not to scream in the moment had been strength, not failure. I stayed longer than I intended, sipping tea, listening to the clock tick. Margaret told me stories of her own youth, of times when she had been dismissed, and how she found her dignity again. She laughed at herself, shook her head at mistakes, but there was pride in her voice. She had survived, and so could I. When I returned to my apartment, the night was silent except for the soft shuffle of snow outside. I set my coat on the chair and stood at the window, thinking of both conversations. Robert had given me direction. Margaret had given me affirmation. Between the two, I felt a fragile but real sense of possibility. I pulled out my journal again and wrote until my hand ached. I wrote about the cafe, about the way Robert's eyes stayed steady on mine, about the warmth in Margaret's living room. I wrote about silence and mirrors, about truth and proof. When I finally set the pen down, I realized my shoulders were no longer hunched. I was sitting straighter. For the first time in years, I could imagine a future where my dad's voice did not define me, a future where Jessica's laughter did not ring in my ears. I could not change the past, but I could shape what came next. As I turned off the lamp and lay down, I felt the city's hum in the distance, the pulse of life continuing around me. My eyes closed slowly, and in that quiet space I knew the choice had already been made. The plan had begun the moment I walked out of that house. Now I had allies. Now I have strength. And soon I would have proof. I was grading papers late into the evening when my phone buzzed against the desk. The name on the screen made my chest tighten. Daniel. My little brother was not one to call without a reason. For a moment I hesitated, staring at the glow of his name, remembering how he had looked at me on Christmas night, his eyes flicking toward me with something like regret before he turned away. I answered and tried to steady my voice. "Hey!" His tone was low, cautious, as if he did not want anyone to overhear. "Can you meet me tomorrow somewhere quiet?" The question startled me. We had not had a real conversation in months, maybe longer. I asked what was going on, but he only said he would explain in person. He named a small diner on the south side, a place our family would never set foot in, and then he hung up. I barely slept that night. My mind kept circling the possibilities. I thought about Robert's words about evidence, about mirrors no one could avoid. Could Daniel be part of that mirror? When morning came, I wrapped myself in my thickest coat and drove through the gray slush of city streets until the neon sign of the diner appeared. Inside, the air smelled of bacon grease and old coffee. Daniel was in a booth near the back, shoulders hunched, hands wrapped tightly around a mug. He looked tired, darker circles under his eyes than I remembered. When I slid into the seat across from him, he tried to smile, but it faltered quickly. "Thanks for coming," he said. I waited, not wanting to push too quickly. He stirred the coffee, though it was already black. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Dad has been using me. He thinks I'm just the quiet one who does what he asks. But I have seen things. I have kept copies." My breath caught. Copies of what? Emails, files, transfers. He leaned in, voice dropping further. "He asked me to wipe some servers last year and clean things up before tax season. I did what he said, but I also saved everything. Something in me knew this day would come. I stared at him, hardly believing. The air between us seemed to vibrate. "Do you know what those files show?" Daniel nodded. "Fraud. Shell accounts. Money funneled through fake buyers. It is bad, Maddie. Really bad." His words hit me harder than I expected. I had always known my dad cared more about appearances than truth, but seeing it laid out like this was something else entirely. For years he had mocked me, dismissed me, treated me like I was less, all while hiding a rot that could bring everything down. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because I saw what he did to you." Daniel's eyes finally met mine. "I should have spoken up a long time ago, but I could not sit there and watch it again. You do not deserve it." Something inside me broke open at his words. For so long I had carried the weight alone, believing even my own siblings had chosen their side. Hearing Daniel admit he saw me, that he knew, felt like a crack of light in a locked room. "Do you still have the files?" I asked. He reached into his backpack and slid a small hard drive across the table. My hand trembled as I pulled it closer. It felt heavier than its size should allow. "I do not know what you want to do with it," he said, "but I cannot keep it anymore. If he finds out I saved this, he will destroy me." I slipped the drive into my coat pocket, the metal cold against my fingers. "You did the right thing." For the first time in years, Daniel looked relieved. We sat in silence, the clatter of dishes and hum of conversation around us. When we finally left, the sky was thick with low clouds, pressing down on the city. He walked me to my car, gave a small nod, and turned away without another word. At home, I set the drive on my desk and just stared at it. The weight of it seemed to fill the room. Proof, real proof. I thought of Robert, of Margaret, of the plan beginning to form like threads pulling together. My heart raced with fear and exhilaration. That night I dreamed of our childhood again. I saw Daniel at 8 years old hiding behind me when our dad's voice rose, his small hands clutching the hem of my shirt. I remembered how I had tried to shield him, even when I could not shield myself. Now, years later, he had given me a weapon to finally fight back. In the morning, I called Robert. "We need to meet," I told him. "This time I have something real." I carried the small hard drive in my coat pocket as if it were fragile glass, careful with every step, aware of its weight against my side. The morning was gray, a thin layer of ice clinging to the sidewalks as I made my way downtown. My breath clouded in front of me, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. By the time I reached Robert's office, I could feel the heat in my cheeks from both the cold and the adrenaline. He greeted me at the door with that same calm steadiness he always carried. The office smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the blinds half drawn against the weak winter sun. I handed him the drive without a word, watching as he set it on his desk like a sacred object. He motioned for me to sit, then plugged it into his computer. The screen lit up with folders, names, and dates. Robert's brows furrowed as he clicked through document after document. Numbers spilled across the screen, transaction lists, shell companies, accounts and names I had never heard. He leaned closer, scrolling faster, muttering under his breath. "This is worse than I thought." He looked at me, his eyes sharp now, the lawyer's instinct fully awake. "These are not just sloppy books. This is deliberate. Fraud. Money laundering. If this gets out, your dad's empire will collapse overnight." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. For years, I had felt powerless under my dad's thumb. Seeing the truth on Robert's screen, undeniable and ugly, felt like air flooding into my lungs after being held underwater. Robert printed a few pages, spreading them across the desk. He pointed to signatures, to dates that aligned too neatly, to fake names tied to properties that never existed. Then he leaned back in his chair. "The question is what you want to do with it. This is dynamite, Madison. It could blow up everything." I stared at the papers, the ink still warm. I thought of my dad's voice calling me garbage, of Jessica's laugh, of my mom's silence. My hands curled into fists. I want them to see it. I want them to know I am not powerless anymore. Robert nodded slowly. "Then we will prepare it carefully. But remember, once this is in motion, there is no going back." The weight of that truth pressed into me, but it did not scare me. It steadied me. We spent hours going through the files. Robert explained what would hold up in court, what would catch the eye of regulators, what might be dismissed as circumstantial. He took notes in his clean script, circling items, highlighting connections. I tried to keep up my head spinning, but every page we touched felt like a brick pulled from the foundation of my dad's house. By late afternoon, the desk was covered in papers. Robert rubbed his temples and leaned back. "This is more than enough to start. But we will need corroboration. Witnesses, people inside the company." "Daniel," I said softly. "He has been covering for Dad for years. He saved these files." Robert looked at me closely. "Then he may already be in danger." The thought chilled me, but before I could answer, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. I excused myself and stepped into the hall. His voice was tense. "Dad is sniffing around. He asked me yesterday if I had backed up any of the files. I told him no, but he did not look convinced." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "Hold steady, Daniel. Do not say anything else. We are working on it." There was a pause, then his voice softer. "Be careful, Maddie. He is more ruthless than you know." I promised him I would and hung up, my heart racing. When I returned to Robert, I told him what Daniel had said. Robert's jaw tightened. Then we moved faster. We began drafting a packet, organizing the most damning pieces into a narrative. Robert said we would prepare duplicates, one for the authorities, one for the press, and one to keep safe. As we worked, the enormity of it grew in my mind. This was not just revenge. This was justice waiting to be lit. That night back at my apartment, I spread the remaining copies across my kitchen table. The glow of the overhead light reflected off the glossy pages. My fingers traced the signatures, the numbers. Each line was a weapon. As I sat there, Chloe's voice echoed in my memory. She was only 10, full of energy, always quick with a question. A week before Christmas, she had tugged on my sleeve at the family party and whispered about overhearing her mom. "Aunt Maddie," she had said. "Mom is always on the phone with some man who gives her presents." At the time, I had brushed it off, assuming it was a childish misunderstanding. But now, as I looked at the documents, I wondered if Jessica had secrets tangled with my dad's. I picked up the phone and called Margaret. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm as always. I told her about the files, about Daniel, about the risk. She listened quietly, then said, "Madison, you have carried their cruelty for too long. This is your chance to set it down. But remember, once you show the truth, you cannot control how it spreads." Her words stayed with me as I set the papers back in order. Control had never been mine to begin with. They have stolen my dignity year after year. Maybe now I would finally reclaim it. The next morning I met Robert again. He had already bound the packet neatly, each page numbered, each exhibit labeled. He handed it to me carefully. "This is the envelope," he said, "when you decide we send it." I held it in both hands, the weight familiar now, the edges sharp against my fingers. I slipped it into my bag, feeling the shift in my body. The girl who had been sent to the kitchen was gone. In her place stood someone ready to fight. The winter sun hung low over the city when I pulled into the parking lot of Carter Realty Group. I had not stepped inside those offices in years, not since I was a teenager fetching my dad's dry cleaning as part of some lesson in responsibility. Now I stood outside the tall glass building, its surface gleaming like nothing could touch it, and all I could think of were the files waiting on my desk at home. Inside that building was the empire my dad had built on lies, an empire I was about to watch crumble. I did not go inside. I only stood there for a few minutes, watching employees hurry through the revolving doors, their coats pulled tight against the wind. I imagined how many of them had no idea what was really happening behind those polished walls. I imagined the way my dad strutted through those halls, chest puffed out, speaking in that booming voice, certain of his untouchable status. My stomach tightened and I turned back toward my car. It was not my job to warn them. Soon enough they would learn. That evening Robert called. He had news. A major developer had suddenly withdrawn from a pending deal with my dad's company. They had cited concerns about stability and trust. Robert said it looked like someone had leaked a hint of what was coming. Maybe another partner who had seen irregularities in the numbers. He told me not to worry, that this actually worked in our favor. But I could hear the edge in his voice. The cracks were showing faster than he expected. The next day, I met Margaret in the lobby of our building. She had her grocery bags in hand and insisted I help her carry them upstairs. We sat in her kitchen as she unpacked apples and bread, and I told her about the developer backing out. She shook her head slowly. "Pride comes before the fall," she said. "Your dad has always mistaken arrogance for strength. The higher a man builds his tower of lies, the harder it crashes when the truth finally arrives." Her words steadied me, but my phone buzzed before I could reply. It was Daniel again. His message was short. "Dad is furious. Lost a deal." I screamed for an hour. "I think he suspects more." I stared at the words, my chest heavy. My dad's rage was something I knew well, something I had endured countless times. But this time the target was shifting. This time his rage was not aimed only at me. Later that week, Jessica invited me for coffee. I almost laughed at the text. She had not reached out to me in months unless it was to brag. Curiosity won, and I agreed to meet her at a sleek cafe in the Loop. She arrived in a tailored coat, her hair perfect, her smile wide. "You look tired," she said as she stirred her latte. "I suppose teaching is draining work." I bit back the retort that rose in my throat. Instead, I asked why she wanted to see me. She leaned in, her voice dropping. "Something is happening with Dad's company. People are whispering. Clients are pulling out. Do you know anything about it?" I held her gaze, my face calm though my pulse hammered. "Why would I know?" She studied me, her lips pursed. "Because you always have that look when you are hiding something." She smiled then, but it did not reach her eyes. "Be careful, Maddie. You would not want to drag the whole family down with you." Her words hung in the air long after she left. She thought she was threatening me, but all I heard was fear. For once, Jessica was not as secure as she pretended. That night, Daniel called again, his voice low. "Dad is calling emergency meetings. He yelled at me for not catching mistakes in the books. He is unraveling." I told him to stay calm, to keep his head down. We were close now. The walls were beginning to shake. The next morning, the newspaper carried a small article about the developer, who had pulled out. No details, just speculation about financial instability. I cut it out and tucked it into the folder Robert had prepared. Proof was building piece by piece. By the end of the week, another blow landed. A second partner backed away from a joint project, citing reputational concerns. My dad raged so loudly that even the neighbors near his office whispered about it. For the first time, people were talking about the Carter name with suspicion instead of admiration. I thought back to every dinner where he told me I was nothing, every party where Jessica basked in his approval while I sat ignored. The memory no longer stung the way it once did. Instead, it fueled me. Robert called again on Friday evening. His voice was calm but urgent. "It is time to decide when to release the packet. The timing is important. Too soon and it gets buried as a rumor. Too late and someone else controls the story." I walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. Snow was falling again, covering everything in silence. My reflection in the glass looked steadier than I felt. But there was no doubt in my mind. Not yet, I told him. Let him sweat. Let the cracks widen. When the moment comes, we will make sure it cannot be ignored. When I hung up, I stood in the quiet of my apartment, the sound of the city muffled by snow. I thought of Daniel caught in the storm, of Jessica with her false smile, of my mom pretending not to see. I thought of my dad pounding his fist on the boardroom table, shouting at men who once admired him. The image filled me with a strange peace. The tower was shaking. Soon it would fall. I woke before dawn, the city outside my window still wrapped in silence, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the envelope Robert had prepared. It lay there in its neat manila jacket, thick with documents, heavy with the truth. My fingers traced the edge of it again and again while my coffee cooled beside me. Each page inside could bring down my dad, my sister, the facade of power they had polished for so long. But each page also carried risk, not just for them, but for Daniel, for me, for anyone who touched it. When the sky began to lighten, I pulled on my coat and drove to Robert's office. He was waiting, his tie slightly loosened, his eyes tired but steady. He had been working late, I could tell. Without a word, he took the envelope from me, laid it on his desk, and began making duplicates. He sealed them one by one, labeling each carefully. One for the authorities, one for the press, one for us to keep safe. He placed them in separate folders and handed one back to me. You understand, Madison, once we send these, there is no going back. His voice was quiet but firm. Your dad will not forgive, your sister will not forget. This will change everything. I nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle in my chest. Change was what I wanted. Silence had been my prison. It was time to break it. Robert dialed a number on his desk phone. Within minutes, we were speaking with Stephen Wright, a federal financial investigator Robert had worked with before. Robert explained the situation carefully, his words precise, his tone professional. I listened to the low rumble of Stephen's voice on the other end, asking questions, confirming details. Finally, Robert slid the phone toward me. He wants to hear from you. My throat tightened, but I lifted the receiver. This is Madison Carter, I said, my voice steady, though my hand trembled. I have information regarding Carter Realty, documents, proof of fraud and laundering. Stephen's voice was calm, measured. Miss Carter, if what you have is legitimate, it will be handled with discretion. You must understand the seriousness. Providing false information is a crime, but if what you say is true, you are protecting countless people from harm. I assured him it was true. My dad had built his fortune on deception. Stephen promised someone would be in touch within days. When I hung up, my heart hammered so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Robert leaned back in his chair. That is one path set. Now the press. We met that afternoon with Dean Roberts, a journalist Daniel had contacted. We sat in the back of a quiet cafe, Dean's notebook open, his pen scratching as he listened. He was a broad man with sharp eyes, the kind of man who smelled stories the way a hunter smells tracks. He asked pointed questions, pressing for clarity. He studied the documents like they were maps to buried treasure. If even half of this holds up, he said finally, it is the kind of scandal that topples names carved into marble. But publishing is a risk. Powerful men do not like being exposed, Robert answered calmly. Which is why copies exist in multiple places. If anything happens to Madison, the story still runs. Dean's eyes flicked to me, gauging my resolve. Are you ready for that kind of storm? I met his gaze. I have lived in storms my whole life. This one is mine to unleash. That night back in my apartment, I barely slept. Every creak in the hall, every car passing outside made me tense. My dad was a man who valued control above all else. If he even suspected what I was doing, I did not doubt he would try to crush me. But I also knew the trap was already closing around him. The documents were out of my hands now. The truth had been set free. 2 days later, Daniel called in a whisper. Dad is watching me. He asked again about backups. He is paranoid. He barely sleeps. His temper is worse. I told him to keep calm, to act normal, but fear curled in my stomach. I hated putting him in danger, hated that my brother was caught between loyalty and survival. But he had given me the weapon. All I could do now was carry it forward. By the end of the week, Robert called again. He said the investigator had scheduled a preliminary meeting. Dean had also confirmed the story would run once verification came through. It was moving faster than I imagined. That evening, I walked the streets near my apartment, the snow crunching beneath my boots, the air sharp in my lungs. Christmas decorations still clung to shop windows, but the season already felt far behind me. I thought of my dad pacing in his office, shouting at employees, clinging to his tower as it shook. I thought of Jessica hiding her panic behind lipstick smiles. I thought of my mom, perhaps still pretending not to notice. I reached the river and leaned against the railing, watching the ice drift under the bridges. The city lights shimmered on the dark water. For the first time in years, I felt taller than the weight pressing down on me. I had sent the storm into motion. Now all I had to do was wait. The knock came at the Carter house just as the family was settling in for dinner. I was not there to see it with my own eyes, but Daniel later told me every detail and I could picture it clearly. The table was set with roasted lamb, candles flickering against the polished silver. My dad seated at the head with his glass of wine lifted in a performance of control. Jessica sat near him, glowing in her designer dress, already rehearsing stories to remind everyone of her successes. My mom moved around the table, straightening napkins that were already straight, fussing with details that never really mattered. Daniel, as always, sat quietly watching. Then came the sound that cut through it all. 3 sharp knocks on the heavy oak door. My dad froze mid-sentence, his fork hovering over the lamb. Jessica frowned and glanced at her phone as if the interruption was meant for her. My mom sighed, muttering about poor timing, but the knock came again, insistent this time, as though the person on the other side would not be ignored. Richard Carter pushed back his chair and strode across the dining room. His movements were sharp, impatient, the way they always were when control slipped from his hands. He opened the door to find a courier standing there, bundled against the cold, a thick envelope in his gloved hand. Richard signed quickly, dismissing the man without a word, and shut the door. He carried the envelope back to the table, holding it like something foul. "What is it?" Jessica asked, her tone sharp with curiosity. "Nothing important," he muttered, though he was already tearing at the seal. The house grew still. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to crackle more softly as he slid the papers out. The first page bore a bold heading, stark black letters spelling out the words that would unravel him. Investigation notice. His face drained of color as he scanned the lines, his lips tightening into a grim slash. He flipped to the next page, then another, his hands beginning to tremble despite his effort to appear unshaken. Daniel told me he had never seen our dad's eyes move so fast, darting from line to line, desperation flickering behind the usual arrogance. Each page laid out transactions, shell companies, property sales to buyers that did not exist. His name was there in signature after signature. He had signed his guilt into permanence. Jessica leaned forward, trying to peek. "Dad, what is it?" she pressed. He ignored her, his jaw set, his breath shallow. Finally, she snatched a page from the pile, and what she saw drained the laughter from her face. Transfers to accounts in offshore banks, dates that lined up with deals she thought were legitimate. Her hand shook as she read. "This cannot be real. It must be a mistake." Richard slammed his palm on the table, the silverware jumping. "Someone is trying to destroy me." "Linda." My mom rose from her chair slowly, as though her body had aged 10 years in a moment. She peered over his shoulder, her lips parting as she traced the lines with her finger. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Richard, your name is on every page." The papers scattered as Jessica pulled more toward her. Her eyes darted wildly until she froze on a section that mentioned correspondence tied to her. Daniel told me her face turned white as she read, and then a photograph slipped loose from between the sheets. It landed face up on the table. Jessica sitting in a restaurant booth, her hand entwined with a man who was not her husband. The air turned heavy. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Jessica snatched at the photograph, her words tumbling over themselves. "It is not what it looks like. I was only networking. He is a client." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Richard's face twisted with fury. "You fool," he spat. "Do you realize what you have done? You jeopardize everything with your carelessness while enemies circle us like wolves." Jessica's mask cracked. "Do not you dare put this on me. You are the one laundering money and lying to everyone." "I only want it out." Their voices rose, colliding with each other, venom spilling across the dining room. Linda sat back down heavily, tears spilling as she buried her face in her hands. Daniel told me he stayed silent, frozen in his chair, though every word felt like thunder in his chest. He had known this day would come, but watching it unfold was like watching the house burn from the inside out. The candles flickered low wax, dripping slowly down their stems. The lamb sat untouched, the scent of rosemary and garlic now bitter in the air. The once perfect dining room, the stage for so many family performances, had become a battlefield. When Daniel finally slipped away to his room, he texted me with trembling fingers. "It is done." 3 words that told me everything I needed to know. I sat in my own apartment, miles away, phone glowing in the dim light. My heart pounded as I read the message. I could picture the scene as if I had been there. My dad's face twisting with rage, Jessica's eyes wide with fear, my mom's silence cracking under the weight of truth. They were trapped in the web they had spun for so long. I set the phone down on the table and closed my eyes. For years I had carried the sting of their words, the ache of being cast aside. I had been the one sitting alone in the kitchen, the one walking out into the cold night with shame pressed into my chest. But not this time. This time it was their turn to sit in silence, their turn to feel the walls close in. The quiet of my apartment felt different that night. It was not the silence of being ignored or dismissed. It was the silence of strength, of justice beginning to hum beneath the surface. I breathed it in, long and steady, and let it fill me. Jessica did not sleep that night. Daniel told me later that he heard her pacing the upstairs hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor long after midnight. Every so often, she slammed a door, muttering curses under her breath. My mom cried quietly in her bedroom, and the sound carried through the vents. Richard locked himself in his study, the light glowing beneath the door until dawn, the faint smell of whiskey drifting down the hallway. By morning, the house looked like a battlefield left behind after the fighting stopped. The lamb from the night before still sat untouched on the table, its surface dried and cracking. Wine glasses leaned half-full, napkins were crumpled and stained. Daniel said the silence at breakfast was unbearable, each of them caught in their own corner trying to make sense of the wreckage. My mom made coffee but never lifted her eyes from the floor. Jessica scrolled through her phone, her fingers shaking, already calculating how to control the narrative. My dad emerged from his study unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw set. He dropped the stack of documents back onto the dining room table with a thud that made my mom flinch. "They are lies," Richard barked. "All of it manufactured. Someone wants to ruin me." Jessica shot back quickly, her voice sharp. "Then explain the photograph. Explain the bank accounts." Richard glared at her. "Do not think you are clean in this. That man is not your husband. If anyone is vulnerable, it is you." Their voices clashed again, rising until Linda cried out for them to stop. She pressed her hands to her temples, her shoulders trembling. For decades, she had chosen silence, but that morning, the weight of it seemed to crush her. Daniel sat still, spoon stirring his coffee, slowly watching, recording every detail in his memory. He did not need to add to the chaos. He knew the truth was already louder than any of their words. By noon, the story had spread online. A news outlet posted the first article citing leaked documents that detailed questionable transactions tied to Carter Realty. The article mentioned offshore accounts, falsified contracts, and potential fraud under federal review. The piece was cautious, careful not to name sources, but the implication was clear. Richard Carter was no longer untouchable. When the headline appeared on Jessica's phone, she let out a gasp loud enough for the whole room to hear. Her fingers trembled as she read, her eyes darting back and forth. She looked up at Richard, panic spreading across her perfect face. "It is everywhere," she whispered. "People are sharing it." Richard snatched the phone from her hand and read in silence, his lips tightening with each line. He hurled the phone onto the couch when he finished, his chest rising and falling like a man trapped in a burning room. The rest of that day was filled with frantic calls. Richard shouted into his phone, demanding loyalty from partners, swearing at attorneys, insisting that no one believe what they were reading. Jessica called friends, her voice trembling as she tried to convince them it was all exaggerated. Gossip. Linda spent hours in her bedroom with the blinds drawn, clutching a rosary she had not touched in years. Daniel texted me updates in brief messages. He is unraveling. She is panicking. Mom is breaking. His words painted the picture vividly enough that I could see it all in my mind. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the snow-covered rooftops, Richard finally emerged from his study again. He stood in the living room, shoulders squared, and declared that no one was to speak of this outside the house. He ordered silence as if it could still save him. Jessica tried to argue, her voice shrill, but he cut her off with a roar. Linda only nodded weakly, too drained to fight. Daniel watched from the staircase unseen. He told me he had never felt such a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear that his dad might discover the truth about the files he saved. Relief that the power that had ruled over them for so long was cracking before his eyes. That night, after everyone had retreated to their rooms, Daniel slipped into his own and locked the door. He lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled arguments below. He texted me one more time. "They are coming apart. It has started." When I read his message, I sat quietly at my own table in my apartment, the hum of the radiator filling the silence. I closed my eyes and imagined the house as it must have looked: papers, scattered voices, raised faces pale. For years, that house had been the stage where I was cast as the fool, the disappointment, the one sent away. Now it was collapsing under the weight of their own choices. I wrote in my journal until my hand cramped. I wrote about the sound of the knock on their door, about the courier holding the envelope, about my dad's hands trembling as he read. I wrote about Jessica's gasp, my mom's sobs, Daniel's quiet observations. I let the words flow steady and sure, each line proof that the silence I carried that night had not been weakness, but strength. In the days that followed, the scandal deepened. Reporters gathered outside Carter Realty, cameras flashing as employees slipped through the doors. More articles surfaced, each one adding to the story, each one pulling another brick from the tower my dad had built. Jessica's photograph appeared on gossip sites, her name trending in whispers of betrayal. My mom's charity friends stopped calling. The invitations she once clutched so dearly vanished. Through it all, I stayed quiet. I taught my classes. I walked to the store. I drank coffee in the mornings. But inside me there was a calm I had never known before. They were finally living in the silence they had forced on me for years. And that was only the beginning. The morning after the envelope arrived, the city woke to headlines that carried my family's name in bold black print. Carter Realty Group under investigation for financial misconduct. The words leapt off the page, unavoidable, splashed across every paper. Every online site repeated on the evening news like a drumbeat. The scandal that had lived quietly in folders and hidden servers was now public knowledge, undeniable and roaring. I sat at my kitchen table with the paper spread in front of me, my coffee growing cold. There was a photograph of my dad entering the office, his jaw clenched, his hand raised as if to shield himself from the cameras. Another shot captured Jessica leaving a restaurant, her face twisted in annoyance, the man beside her cropped halfway out of the frame. It was all there, every secret made visible. My phone buzzed endlessly with messages from colleagues at the school, from distant cousins, from people I had not spoken to in years. They wanted to know if I was all right, if I had seen the news, if I had anything to say. I typed nothing back. I only let the silence hold the same silence that had once been forced on me. Now my choice. Daniel called that afternoon. His voice was shaky. Dad is furious. He accused me of betraying him and said I was the only one who could have leaked files. I denied it, but he kept shouting, saying he would cut me off, disown me. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Stay calm. He is lashing out because he is cornered. You are not alone in this. Daniel exhaled heavily. You should have seen him, Maddie. He looked broken. I have never seen him like that. For a moment I pictured my dad pacing in his office, red-faced, his empire cracking around him. The image did not bring joy, but it did bring relief. That evening, I walked past his building downtown. Crowds of reporters stood outside, microphones ready, cameras flashing as employees slipped in and out. Some faces were pale, others tense. No one smiled. The building that once gleamed with pride now looked heavy, sagging under the weight of exposure. When I returned home, Margaret knocked on my door. She held a casserole dish in her hands, insisting I needed to eat. I let her in and we sat together at my small table. She patted my hand gently. I saw the news, Madison. I imagine this is not easy no matter what they did to you. I swallowed hard. Part of me thought I would feel triumphant. Instead, I feel steady but tired. She nodded. That is how justice feels sometimes. It is not fireworks. It is slowly settling like the ground becoming solid after an earthquake. Her words lingered with me. Justice was not about joy. It was about balance returning after years of being tilted. The next day I received another call from Daniel. His voice was calmer, almost resigned. Jessica's husband confronted her. The photos went public. She tried to spin it as work, but he is not buying it. He threatened divorce. She is in tears, but she still finds time to blame you. I shook my head softly, though he could not see it. She always needs someone to blame. Daniel gave a small, bitter laugh. And Mom is begging Dad to fix it, but he can barely hold himself together. She is terrified of losing her standing with her charity circles. Hearing their chaos did not hurt me the way it once would have. It felt distant now, like a storm raging miles away. Its sound carried faintly on the wind. I was safe inside watching from a window. That weekend, Dean's article ran in the Sunday paper, a full spread with charts, quotes, and photographs. The words painted the picture clearly. Fraud, laundering, deception. Every lie mapped out for the world to see. My dad's empire was no longer a fortress. It was a ruin exposed brick by brick. I walked into the corner store that morning and saw neighbors whispering over the paper. One of them glanced at me, recognition flashing in her eyes, but she said nothing. She only looked down quickly, as if embarrassed to have been caught staring. For once I was not the one carrying shame. It was theirs to hold now. Daniel came to visit that evening. He sat on my couch, slouched and exhausted, his eyes rimmed red. I made him tea and waited for him to speak. Finally, he whispered, he said he wished I had never been born. The words pierced me, even though I had heard their echoes all my life. I reached for Daniel's hand. He does not mean it. He is drowning and he is dragging whoever he can reach. You are stronger than him. He looked at me, searching for belief, and finally nodded. For the first time since we were children, I saw in him the boy who had clung to me for protection. Only now I was able to give it. Days passed and the news cycle did not let go. Each morning brought new details, more documents uncovered, more quotes from former employees who had seen too much and stayed quiet for too long. My dad's face became a symbol of greed. My sister's scandals became gossip fodder. My mom's name was whispered with pity in charity circles she once ruled. One evening, I found myself walking near their house. The windows glowed dimly, the decorations from Christmas still sagging on the porch. I stood across the street, hidden in shadow, and watched. Inside, I could see figures moving tense and hurried. I imagined their voices raised, their tempers flaring, their unity shattered. The house that had once been my cage was now their prison. I turned away and walked back into the night, the cold air filling my lungs, my steps steady. The silence that followed me was not the silence of humiliation anymore. It was the silence of strength, the pause before the final word was spoken. I woke that Sunday morning to a stillness so deep it pressed against my chest like a hand. The streets outside my apartment were muffled by fresh snow, the kind that coated every branch and dulled every sound. For weeks, my phone had been buzzing with notifications, headlines, questions from people I had not spoken to in years. But that morning there was only quiet. I sat up slowly, the blanket sliding from my shoulders, and listened. No cars honking, no footsteps in the hall, no buzz from my phone on the nightstand. It felt as though the world had paused to let me breathe. I walked to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and waited for the water to boil. Steam curled into the air, fogging the window as I spooned grounds into the filter. The rich smell of coffee spread through the room, grounding me. I poured a cup and carried it to the table where my journal lay open, pages already thick with ink and tears from nights when I could not keep my thoughts inside. I traced the lines I had written days before, words about silence and shame, about my dad's voice and Jessica's laughter. Then I turned to a clean page. The pen felt heavier than usual in my hand. I pressed it down and began to write. This time the words came steady. I wrote about the moment I left that house, how the snow struck my face like tiny needles, how my boots crunched against the pavement as I walked away. I wrote about the call I made, the one that set everything into motion, and how my silence that night carried more strength than if I had screamed. I wrote about Daniel, about his trembling voice on the phone, when he told me he had copies of everything, about the look in his eyes when he handed me the hard drive. I wrote about Margaret, the way she poured me tea and told me silence could be strength, the way she reminded me that carrying cruelty was not my burden anymore. As the ink filled the page, I felt my shoulders relax. It was the first time in years I wrote without shame pressing into my ribs. My story was no longer locked inside me. The phone rang, startling me. It was Robert. His tone was measured, but I could hear relief. The investigators had moved quickly. The evidence Daniel saved was more than enough to open formal charges. My dad's name was already on every desk at the agency, and they were preparing to freeze accounts, interview partners, and subpoena employees. Robert said it was only a matter of time before indictments were handed down. I thanked him quietly. For months, I had lived with the fear of what my dad might do if he found out. Now the balance had shifted. It was his turn to live with fear. Later that afternoon, Margaret knocked on my door. She wore her thick wool hat, cheeks pink from the cold, and carried a pie that still radiated warmth. I invited her in and we sat together in her living room, the scent of cinnamon filling the air. She sliced 2 pieces, set one in front of me, and asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth. I feel like I am finally breathing air that belongs to me. Her eyes softened and she reached for my hand. That is what happens when you put down a burden you never should have carried. She squeezed my hand lightly. You stand taller. You see further. Her words sank deep into me. All those years of walking into family gatherings with my head bowed, waiting for the next insult, had bent me. Now, slowly, I was straightening. When I left her apartment, the hallway was warm and quiet. I stepped into the lobby, and there was Robert, coat open, file folders under his arm. He had come by to check on me. He gave a small smile when he saw me. You know, this is just the beginning, he said. Your dad will fight, but the walls are already closing in. The case is strong. You have changed the story. I felt gratitude swell in my chest. I am not afraid anymore, I told him. Whatever comes, I know who I am now. That evening, Daniel came by. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion, but his eyes looked different, lighter. We sat on the couch with mugs of tea between us, the steam rising like a curtain of warmth. For the first time in years, we laughed together. He told me he was thinking of leaving the company, of starting fresh somewhere that did not carry our dad's shadow. You should, I said. You deserve a life that is yours. He nodded, his voice soft. For a long time, I thought being quiet was the only way to survive. But you showed me that silence can mean something else. I felt tears rise in my eyes, not of sorrow, but of recognition. We had both lived in that house under the same weight. Now for the first time we were standing outside of it together. When Daniel left, he hugged me tightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "It is not me alone," I said. We both broke the silence. After the door closed, I walked back to my desk. The journal lay open, the pen waiting. I picked it up and wrote again. That night they thought I was garbage, but garbage does not rot quietly. It exposes what festers beneath the gold. The words settled onto the page with finality. I closed the journal and placed my hand on the cover. The hum of the city outside carried on, neighbors laughing, dishes clattering, cars passing. Life continued ordinary and full. For once I felt part of it. The silence in my apartment was no longer emptiness. It was peaceful. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy wind rattling the windows. The storm from the night before had left drifts of snow piled along the street, but the sky was clearing, streaked with pale blue. I brewed coffee and sat by the window with the mug cupped in my hands. For years, the mornings after family gatherings were filled with dread, replaying every harsh word, every cruel laugh. This time I felt something different. The air carried a lightness, the kind that comes when a door has been shut for good. I turned on the television and the news anchor's voice filled the room. They were reporting again on my dad's company, this time with footage of him stepping out of a courthouse flanked by lawyers, his face red with frustration. The crawl at the bottom of the screen listed charges being investigated: fraud, money laundering, falsified contracts. My stomach twisted, but not with fear. It was the same sensation as watching a storm move over a landscape you no longer stood in. You could see the destruction, but you were safe behind glass. I thought of Jessica. Her scandal had reached the gossip pages, the photographs plastered across websites. Her carefully crafted image as the perfect daughter, the accomplished professional, was cracked wide open. I imagined her pacing her apartment phone, buzzing with unanswered calls, trying to hold on to the pieces of her reputation. And my mom clinging to whatever scraps of social standing she could, her hands trembling at every whisper. For years, I would have pitied her. Now I only felt distance. She had chosen silence every time I was humiliated. Now silence had turned its back on her. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by again. He looked tired but steadier than before. He told me he had resigned from Carter Realty, walked out of the office with his head high while others stared. He said it felt like shedding a skin he never wanted to wear. We sat in the living room, the afternoon light slanting across the floor, and he spoke of plans to move to start a business of his own. I listened, proud of him, proud of us. For so long, we had been tied to a house that only took from us. Now we were free to imagine futures untouched by our dad's control. After he left, I took a walk through the neighborhood. Children were sledding down a hill, their laughter carrying in the cold air. Couples walked with their dogs, neighbors waved as I passed. For years, I had felt like a ghost drifting among them, weighed down by secrets and shame. That evening, I felt present, my steps solid on the ground. As night fell, I returned home and lit a candle on my table. I opened the journal once more and wrote about the day. I wrote about watching my dad's face on television, about Daniel finding courage, about the quiet joy of ordinary life continuing all around me. Each word felt like a stone laid into a new foundation, one built not on fear but on truth. When I finished writing, I leaned back and let the silence fill the room. My mind drifted back to that night at the dining table, the words that had cut so deep, garbage he had called me. I thought of how those words had followed me for years, shaping how I saw myself. Now they no longer had power. They were only echoes in an empty room. The silence around me was not emptiness, it was a choice. It was the space where I could finally hear my own voice. I stood and walked to the window. The city lights glittered against the snow, steady and unbothered. For the first time in my life, I felt steady too. My family's empire was crumbling, but I was not. I was stronger than I had ever been. I knew my dad would keep fighting in court, that Jessica would scramble to repair her image, that my mom would clutch at appearances. But none of it mattered anymore. They no longer held me. Their voices no longer defined me. I had stepped out of the house that night and into a life of my own. And now, after carrying this story with me, I want to ask you something. What would you have done if your own family had pushed you so far that silence was the only weapon left? Would you have stayed at the table, swallowing the pain? Or would you have walked out into the night to let the truth speak for itself? If this story has moved you, if you have felt the sting of betrayal or the power of reclaiming your own voice, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me your stories, and let us remind each other that dignity can be restored no matter how deep the wounds. Do not forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join me for more stories of revenge, of family drama, of betrayal and justice. Because sometimes silence is not a weakness. Sometimes silence is the sharpest revenge of all.